Tenets of Blended and Personalized Learning. This webinar is focused on the blended learning tenet of teacher as designer. As we think about blended and personalized classrooms, they have learners who feel safe, valued, and recognized, who understand what they are learning and why they are learning it, and who experience learning that meet their needs and who are invested and engaged learners. As we dive deeper into the idea and tenet of teacher as designer, I'm going to turn it over to Beth Swans to get us set with this tenet.
So when we think about teachers as designers, there are thousands and thousands of decisions that a teacher makes in the classroom every day. And those decisions are, I'd like to say all of them are very intentional, but as a classroom teacher, I know some of them just sort of happen. But we're going to talk about the decisions that you really make intentionally. Like as you design your classroom to create a personalized learning experience for students, the students that are sitting right in front of you. And what we mean by that is we're really going to think about ways to connect our unique learners to learning opportunities that best fit the way that they are learning, their learning styles, their interests, and we also want to build in scaffolds that help them to be successful. Now, you may have cringed a little bit when I said we're going to design a personalized learning experience, because when I say those words, immediately what flies into my head is individualized learning plans for every single student. That is not what we're talking about. And I'm going to say that again. That is not what we're talking about. We are really talking about connecting with our students and connecting with our content that we can help students to structure our classroom in a way that helps meet the needs of students in front of us. Because every learner is an individual, we're going to work to connect every learner to our content. And we do that through many different ways. And some of those we'll be talking about as we work through this tenet.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Beth. As we think about that tenet as our larger area, we're going to dive into the practices within our tenet. As we think about the practices as a whole, Gina Rogers, can you give us a setup for those practices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the teacher as designer tenet, there are two practices that fall in like the first phase of the personalized alignment tool. And so the first practice is that the teacher uses data to inform instruction. And so what that means is that you're continually collecting data and that you're making instructional decisions based upon that data that you collect. And so the real emphasis here is that you are informing your instruction, that you're changing things based upon what you're seeing. You're being responsive to what your kids know and what they haven't learned yet. And then the second practice is that teachers provide a clear vision of mastery. And so kids really need to know what success looks like within a certain learning objective. And so they need to know what that looks like. And then teachers need to be continually monitoring students' progress towards mastery of that certain learning objective.
Thanks for that overview, Gina. Let's really turn it towards our first practice within this tenet that you mentioned as teacher uses data to inform instruction. Mindy Carney, let's get us set up and really get our mind wrapped around what that means.
Teacher using data to inform instruction is probably something that we're doing all the time. We collect all types of data, and then it's really thinking about what do we do with it. But we also need to be really intentional about the types of data that we're collecting and how we're going to use that to inform instruction moving forward. And so one way I think to fine tune this is to really reflect on the types of questions that we're asking our students and thinking about what we need to know from our students, and then forming the types of questions and maybe tasks that we're asking our students to do, so that the information then that we gather from them will really ensure that we have an insight on where they are in their learning.
And so our goal is really to provide that data aligned instruction and also provide it in multiple ways that reach this ultimate goal of building kind of self-directed students or self-directed learners. So teachers need to think a lot about the structures that they're using for delivering that instruction. And so, for example, if I've collected data and I see kind of that I have a group of kids that are meeting, I have a group of kids that are close, and then I have a group of kids that are really far from meeting. How am I designing maybe 3 different paths for those kids to walk down to get to where they need to go?
So, in order to sort of dig deeper, we recognize that there are lots of different ways we could do this. But for this webinar, we want to just dig into 3 examples of ways that you might consider working with the data from students. So, and each of those examples sort of has to do with exit tickets. We chose exit tickets purposefully because we know that exit tickets are a pretty common practice in many classrooms. So it's an easy way to get data from students as they are getting ready to leave the classroom at the end of a class period. What we want to talk about is how can you use that data then as a teacher to design the learning experience. So first of all, you need to think about what is that data that you're going to collect. What is your exit ticket going to be? What do you really need to know from the students? This whole idea is creating the structure in your classroom that will allow you to differentiate in different ways for students. So if we're collecting data that we're going to use to sort of send students down on different paths, as Gina said, what is that data we're going to be looking for? What are the questions that we want to ask? And it seems like there are sort of 3 different ways that you can come to exit tickets. One way, which is a very common way, is to ask a review question or a application question from the lesson that day. Like in math, you give them an equation and ask them to solve it. In science, it may be a specific question about what the content was that day. In language arts, whatever that you're working with, it's very specific to what they did in the class that day. So it's kind of like a problem to solve. Another completely different sort of exit ticket would be a more social, emotional focus. Like, what was the hardest part of the lesson today? That gives you a lot of insight as they say what the hardest part was to where they might be in that learning progression, where they are in this process, what do they understand, where are they not feeling confident. What was the easiest part of the lesson might also give you insight into what part you might not want to spend much more time on. Another completely different way is, what is something you learned today? Tell me 3 takeaways, 3 standouts. Or what is a question that you still have from today's learning? So those are 3 different ways that you might structure the exit ticket. Then, what are you going to do with that information? So in blended learning, we talk about some very basic designs of blended learning. And we talk about 3 different ways to structure your classroom. And we have a graphic that sort of goes into a little bit more detail about these 3 different ways. This is something we talk about often, and we just want to make sure that we have a common understanding of what station rotation, playlists, and choice boards are. So just very simply, station rotation is grouping students together, and as a group, they will move through a rotation of stations. This works really well when you have a task that can be broken down into steps. It also works really well as a review, if you have different kinds of reviews that you want to work on, or if you have different modes of getting new information. Maybe they're going to watch a video together, and then they're going to talk about it with some questions. The value add for station rotation is they're working in a group. So it's really about academic conversation, it's about group learning. The second kind of thing we talk about often is a playlist. And you could think about a playlist as a to-do list. It is a chronological, it's a hierarchy. So you have to do the first thing before you move to the second thing, before you move to the third thing. It is a logical progression of tasks. One of the things that often is very helpful in a playlist, you can include a teacher check-in as part of that playlist so that you know they're going to do a couple steps and they're going to check in with you. You also, as a teacher, can take out part of the playlist for specific students. So you can have a kind of a general playlist for the whole class, but you can make that playlist fit the needs of students by assigning them different parts of it. It is very, very easy to differentiate. That's the value add for a playlist. The third thing we often talk about is a choice board. This might look like a tic-tac-toe board. It might look like just squares of different tasks. They're not necessarily hierarchical, they're not necessarily logical, but it is groups of things that need to be done for the learning. And these can be used, you can color code things. You have to do 3 that are blue. You have to do 2 that are green. It can be a tic-tac-toe where you have to make a tic-tac-toe shape. These can be independent tasks, or they can be group tasks, they can be partner tasks. This is the one where students have the most control because they're making choices about what it is they are going to do. Again, as a classroom teacher, you can also set some parameters for specific students. So all 3 of these are things that we talk about often in a blended learning classroom. And they kind of meet different needs. So if I have exit tickets, I think a very logical way is to think about a playlist. How could I create a playlist that would give students entry points based on their exit tickets? And then I could create like spots in that playlist for them to join. It's just one very, very simple example. But this teacher as designer is really creating that structure in your classroom where students can work in different ways.
I love the connection that you just made, Beth, about that structure and how it could look different with the different ways that you look at exit tickets. And to add in the idea too that the teacher kind of controls the ones that you put forward, but what if we thought about it in a way of putting it forward of students selecting where they were at in their exit tickets. Like we've seen an example where a teacher had buckets set up in her room, and the buckets were, I'm just learning this, I'm almost there, I can own it, or I'm a pro. And that helps the students to start to advocate for themselves of where they feel like they're at in their learning, but it also gives them a voice in their classroom too, which to me, as you were talking, Beth, makes me also see the connection to choice boards as well, right? Because we've seen in different classrooms where a teacher might make up 3 different types of choice boards, and the students get to select which choice board that they want to start with. We saw a great one with a fun basis of salsa, right? Mm-hmm. It was mild, medium, or spicy of wherever the students wanted to start. And so kind of getting the students' voice in those locations and those places helps to have them gain some ownership within that. And so as we think about that, Mindy, we have been able to engage in some great conversations with other people around what we can really do with data, right?
Yeah, I think the challenging thing is, and I know I did this in the classroom, is I was always gathering all the data, and then I'd look at it and be like, now I don't know what to do with it, or what does this data tell me? And so I had a really great conversation with Erica Bosmick, who's also a member of the Blended Learning team, earlier this week. And I was talking to her about something that was called the 4-column data sort. And I don't know if Erica called it that. That's just what I'm calling it. And what's really neat about this is that it allows us to take all of our exit tickets and kind of sort them into 4 different columns so that we have a better understanding of where students are, and then what scaffolds or how we might design some of these great structures that Amber and Beth have both been talking about. Because the hard thing is then, well, what activities do I give them? Or what tasks do I put into this? That's the hard part. We can say, hey, here's a choice board, or here's a playlist. But as teachers, we think, so what are the most powerful activities that I can design to put in these so that students are gaining the learning that they need? And so Erica does a really nice job of kind of explaining how we might use this 4-column data sort to help us figure out where our students are, and then we can design opportunities for them to learn. What if I am still looking at other types of data around my instruction? So what are some strategies that you see, or what are some things that teachers could try in their teams or independently, or with a coach, if they're looking to kind of really look closely at their instruction and see what's working for kids and what's not?
Now, you made me think about being able to chart data.
Yeah.
This picture or this type of chart, on the left you would put the teacher name,
right,
and in the next column you put how many students each teacher has, and this chart shows having 4 groupings. You could have 3 groupings, you could have 2 groupings. I think an important part of this chart is identifying the priority standards. So this is not 2 ability group for the whole year.
Right.
This is for a period of instruction. So if you identify your priority standard and list it up here so that all teachers on the team are aiming at the same thing, and we design our assessment, and as part of that assessment design, we are going to either create a proficiency scale, maybe it's 4, 3, 2, 1, or we're going to do it by percentage. Everybody who has 80% or above is green.
Sure.
From 79, and divide your 4 groups. If the teachers agree on all that ahead of time and can chart their data and come to the meeting that way, the real meat of this conversation is getting into what students know and don't know. And we work with the proficient and higher.
Right.
And you can keep the colors. I'm going to refer to them by color.
Sure.
For ease. But so if we start with that darkest green color and we talk about, okay, the students, bring your student work samples and have them with you at the meeting. Lay out those kids that are that you placed in the green. What do they know and what can we do?
Sure.
That way, it is just the facts, but we really want to see, when we're aiming for understanding main ideas and details, what can kids do? Okay, they can identify the main idea. They can identify 3 key details.
Sure.
Oh, I can see from our test, they also could read grade level material.
Sure.
They could identify the problem and solution. They could identify the main characters. So that's a list of all those skills.
Yeah.
So then you do the same thing for the next group. So let's say those light green kids, okay? If we're working towards main idea and details, could they all identify the main idea? Okay, maybe majority of them could identify the main idea. Oh, but I can see here, they're having trouble with the details.
Sure.
Or maybe they couldn't identify, I mean, could be anything, could be
Sure.
the main characters.
Yeah.
But look at what that group can do that you're aiming for, and what that group can't yet do.
Right.
Do that for each of the groups, because then you can talk about next steps.
Right.
You might find that everybody that isn't in the dark green are proficient. Maybe none of them can identify details.
Sure.
So your instructional next step is to do read alouds and make sure that you and them together are working on picking out the details that matter in the story, or what comes first, what comes next, what's the end, but really hone in on what students know and can do in order to make that bridge, so that then eventually they're all making that progress.
Yeah, and I think this really resonates with me, because I know when I was in the classroom, one of my challenges is that I always knew what it looked like when kids had gotten there, but I had a hard time figuring out what steps it took them to get there. And so to be able to identify the characteristics of those students who have already attained that skill or that target, it kind of helps me, I think, identify then if this student's here, I just have to get this one little part figured out. It helps me understand maybe the progression of that learning a little bit better, which probably would have been super helpful when we were building proficiency scales, because I feel like that's kind of the same work, but this maybe provides evidence for that, instead of with a proficiency scale where you might be like, well, I think this is, what it would look like, but it really gives you some evidence of maybe what that looks like. And I would say too, one of the things I noticed that you said, Erica, is that then you plan your next steps of instruction. So this is where your scaffolds kind of come in. You might still have your students who are working on main idea and details, but you might provide like a graphic organizer for kids so that they have to, fill in spots or give them some key ideas for hints as they're working to help move them along. So it might help you identify which scaffolds will be successful instead of just a shot in the dark, which I feel like I know I was doing. Like, I'm going to try this and see if this gets kids, and if not, I guess I'll try something else tomorrow. So it might help you be a little bit more targeted in those scaffolds that you add in instead of a hope and a prayer, right?
Most definitely. And I think this chart is very helpful. But the other key is to have the actual student assessment or student work samples with you.
Oh, sure.
Because if you are working to define that progression, which so often we're trying to do, like we're trying to figure out how you get from not knowing it to knowing it, but seeing the student work in that way and being able to move the papers around.
Sure.
Oh yeah, these two can do this, but these three can't. That also helps build that picture in your mind for
right.
The instructional next step for these guys then is this. We're going to get them closer if we do this. So yes, I agree. It helps with the progression, using this and having those work samples with you.
That's awesome. I really connect with this. I think this is amazing.
That was a great example from Erica. As we move and shift into the other practice that is part of our teacher as designer tenet, we're going to look at how teachers provide a clear vision of mastery. Beth, would you be able to kind of talk us through this and get us set with what this means?
Absolutely. So I came across an article that's all about data. It's called the 5 Tips to Improve Student Outcomes with Data, and we'll include this as a resource. In this article, they give a fantastic example about thinking about golf as we're thinking about a way to have a clear vision of mastery. So in golf, there is a par for every hole on the golf course. The par is, everybody knows what it is. It's on the scorecard, very transparent, public information. And during the round, you can measure yourself constantly about, now, if I'm playing golf, par means nothing because I'm going to be way over. But for most people, they can measure how they're doing based on par. How many strokes have I had to get to the hole? If we continue to think it's easy, you can determine your standing in relation to par, not in relation to other players, but you're measuring yourself against that goal, which is par. There's nothing as a surprise. It's all crystal clear. Now think about that as a classroom teacher. As a teacher, you can be that transparent. Each lesson could have a par or a goal, that's mastery. And the students should be able to keep track of their learning in relation to that par or to that mastery at any point in the instruction. Now, I will say that is a goal. That is a goal that may be a new thought that we're thinking about mastery for every single lesson instead of a standard. We often talk about mastery in a standard. This is thinking of breaking it down even smaller. How do students know what the goal is that they're aiming for in every single lesson? So that's really what this providing a clear vision of mastery, that's really what we're aiming for.
All right, Beth, I really like your analogy of golf, and it really got me thinking a little bit about how we put into place different structures. So different players, no matter, how tall they are, how fast they swing the golf club, are able to achieve par. And so that's done through like different tee boxes, right? And so for me, I play at the tips. The front tips, because I do not hit the ball very far, but yet I'm still able to make par a lot of times because I have that scaffold in place. And so this got me thinking a little bit about this idea of worked examples, because worked examples, they do provide kind of two functions. First, they show a model of mastery. So like what students are going to be able, or how students will know how to do something or see that something's right. but then it also provides them a scaffold that they might need in order to be successful. And so a worked example is just a teacher is providing a worked out example of some sort of a problem. And so like in math, many times we see teachers just kind of show like, here's all the different steps that go into solving this equation. And we can see in this example that Emily Korth has provided us that she's given us some different examples for how to simplify these different equations. We can also see worked examples in English language arts. If a teacher provides just an example of like a mentor text, for example, of what it looks like to have successfully created a piece of writing and a way that's meeting mastery.
All right, so I have one other example that I think is a little bit different. It's called a single point rubric. And this idea comes from Jennifer Gonzalez. And what I like about the single point rubric is that we're all very familiar with rubrics. And what I always found challenging when I was creating a rubric for my classroom was that I was trying to envision all of the things my students might do wrong. And so I would make sure that I had written all of those things out and everything that was to the right of where I wanted them to be. And so a single point rubric is a little bit different than that. It really has 3 different columns. One of them shows students exactly what you're looking for. So if I think about riding a bike and breaking that down into maybe 3 small steps, maybe the first thing that students have to do or kids would have to do is to hop on that bike and begin pedaling immediately. Well, that is one factor to a couple different things that students would need to, or kids would need to ride a bike. So students should be able to look at that middle column and know exactly what the expectation is. And then on both sides of that, on the left side, it's going to show things that still need improvement, and that's blank. And then on the opposite side of that, on the right-hand side, it will give an opportunity for there to be feedback about how students are exceeding those expectations. And the nice thing about this, I think, is that students can use this as their own self-assessment. So they can look at their piece of writing, they can look at a math problem and say, these are the things I'm doing, yes. Or this was the part that I'm still a little unclear of. I'm gonna write that down. This shows that I have grasped this concept. Here's my evidence for that. And it really takes some of that, I think, grading out of my hands and puts it back into the hands of the student. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm not going to look at work or also provide feedback myself, but I think it really empowers students to be able to look at that single point rubric, know exactly what the expectations are and what mastery would look like, and then decide for themselves, what do I still need to work on? And what evidence can I provide to show, hey, I've got this and I can move on?
Both of these practices and all of these examples hopefully show you the important role that teachers play within designing their classroom experiences to become more personalized by being able to be clear with your students about what mastering looks like, and also being able to understand what your students are getting out of your classroom experiences, and to be able to continue to work with them to help meet them to have success. Teaching really is an art, and we need to figure out how we can balance all of those pieces together to best meet our students. And so we hope that that makes it clear what we mean by teacher as designer, and as we think about blended and personalized classrooms. So as we conclude this webinar series, we ask you to remember to keep the person in personalization.